Hello, Edison duelists. This is Dionysus, aka Young Puds, coming at you with more shameless, hypebeast Gigavise content. Now, what could be more shameless and hypebeast than a tier list video? So that's exactly what we're doing today. And specifically, this tier list is going to be about the Gigavise matchup spreads. One of the most common questions I see asked in the Discord, in YouTube comments, and just in general is how the Gigavise deck matches up against the various decks in the Edison meta. Of course, Edison is a very diverse meta, and I've tried to pick out just about every relevant deck that I have seen in tournament play or on the dueling book ladder, and I thought I would just go through each of them and briefly cover how I think the Gigavise deck does against them. So I'll put an example in for each tier that we have here, and then we'll fill out the list. You can get on with your day a little more prepared for the new, fresh, and exciting Gigavise meta. So right off the bat, up at the top, we have here the free win category. Just for example, I'll put Aliens in there. We know Aliens is not a good deck. We know Gigavise is a very good deck. So we're going to have a free win if you sit across from your opponent and they summon an Alien Ammonite. Now, this is Yu-Gi-Oh! And there's a lot of variance in this game, and every deck can beat every deck. However, Aliens is definitely going to have a near impossible time defeating Gigavise. Next, we have Heavily Favored. These are decks that we are definitely strong against. However, they do pose a potential threat, so you cannot just turn your brain off. I think an excellent example of a deck that we are heavily favored against is going to be Machina Variants. Because of Titanial, because of Stardust Dragon, we're not really scared of the Hamster Raikou Caius action. Gigavise decks tend to have less back row to stop us, and they also tend to really like just leaving a gear frame. A very common and not even terrible opening turn from the Machina decks is going to be gear frame, search fortress, pass. That is a perfect opportunity for us to OTK them on the spot with a variety of different lines. So for that reason, we'll put Machinas in heavily favored. Next category is going to be Heads Up. These are decks that, while we're definitely favored against and we have good matchups into, you need to be careful, you need to be cautious. These are also decks that we might have a kind of weak game one against, but post sideboard, they don't really stand a chance. So I think the perfect example of a deck like this is going to be the Norlaris builds. Obviously, it's very, very scary if a Norlaris does resolve, but it's inconsistent, and especially after sideboard, it's not a problem at all. So that's what the Heads Up category is. Next is 50-50. These are decks that, like the title says, are 50-50. They could go either way. A lot of it comes down to variance. A lot of it comes down to skill expression. But your opponent might have good tools to combat you. You might have good tools to combat them. And while it might be a little controversial, I'm going to put the fancy Fishborg Frog OTK variant that we're seeing be very popular now in this category. This is a really good deck. Substitute is just a good card, and this is also really the only other deck that, at least to me, feels like they can match us. It's another deck that feels like a modern deck that's just out of place in Edison. And I've also noticed that it really does come down to the better player winning these matches. If you outplay your opponent, you're going to win. If you make mistakes, you're going to get punished, and you're just going to lose. On to Unfavorable. I'll put Tethys Fairies here. The fairies are definitely going to give us a lot of trouble. Cards like Archlord Christia, cards like Herald of Orange Light are big problems for us. But I do think the Tethys variants that are just trying to draw a million cards, they're just more inconsistent. They're just a lot weaker. They're not as strong as other fairy decks, and for that reason, we'll call that an unfavorable matchup. And I'm not going to mince words. I'm not going to waste any more time Fairies really feels like an unwinnable matchup a lot of the time. Archlord Christia really punishes this deck. Herald of Orange Light really punishes this deck. So whether it's Christia Sworn, even the Recruiter build, because we don't really have access to Deck Devastation Virus, these are decks that are just going to give us a whole lot of trouble. You're counting on them to brick. You're counting on having a really good side deck plan. But without a doubt, Fairies is the worst matchup for Gigavise. So now that we've got a good understanding of what these tiers are, let's just go through each of the remaining decks, and I'll tell you how we match up against them. So let's talk about Quickdraw. Quickdraw is maybe the quintessential Edison deck. It's often suggested that players pick it up as their first deck to learn the format. I think that advice continues to hold true. However, I would call this a free win for Gigavise. Their plays are just not very strong. Their ceiling feels low. Even if they do something like put out a Titanial, they're not able to back up that Titanial and give it multiple negates in the way that perhaps Amaryllis might. And in general, the deck is just slow and underpowered. They're not going to be playing enough Interruption to interfere with us. They lose to Royal Oppression, so you're generally not going to see Royal Oppression. And on top of that, they play Lonefire Blossom, which means you can side in Autonomous Action Unit and get a free Lonefire Blossom summon. So for that reason, I think, without a doubt, I consider Quickdraw decks a free win. Another deck I would consider a free win is going to be Crystal Beasts. Crystal Beast, I think I've been seeing a true hero play this on the Dueling Book ladder. So he's a very good player. I think maybe he sees something in the deck, but it is just not very strong, and Gigavise is going to just completely demolish it every single time. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Gadgets. Gadgets is another deck that is just not very strong. They do have access to an oftentimes main decked Royal Oppression. However, if you're playing a deck like Gigavise, you need to be prepared to answer back row. You need to be prepared to deal with these kind of threats. And for that reason, I'm going to put the Gadget matchup in heavily favored. Similar to Machina, it's very easy to find yourself in a situation where you can OTK them, but they are not quite a free win because of the constant threat of Royal Oppression. Lightsworns. Lightsworns are another deck that you can get blown out by if you're opening a little slow, if they're opening a little fast. I think it's definitely a favorable matchup. You could argue even it's in heavily favored, but Judgment Dragon is a threat. It's a very good card, and I think it has to be respected. So for that reason, we'll put Lightsworns in heads up. Another deck that can just go right into heads up is going to be X-Sabers. This is tricky. I think X-Sabers is probably a pretty good deck. Fultrel is a very good card. Unfortunately, I think we have good answers to their recruiters. We have good answers to their boards that they're able to make. However, if you find yourself in a situation where you're needing to just pass while you collect combo pieces, X-Saber Airbellum is definitely going to present a problem to you. Past that, they don't really have a great way to answer any of our strong boards, which is really the only reason that I would put them not in 50-50 or even unfavorable, because Airbellum ripping cards out of your hand is definitely a huge punish. However, it's also something that you can play around, so I think heads up is a fair place. Next, let's talk about Evil Heroes with Dark Gaia and everything. This is a real deck. It's not played very often, but because it does have Fossil Dyna, it can present a problem. I think also it can just OTK you out of nowhere with a big Evil Hero and a Metalmorph. However, the flip side of that is a lot of times they find themselves not quite able to close out the game, and you're then able to mark their big Evil Hero monster and win yourself very, very easily. So while Fossil Dyna does present a problem, a good Gigavise player is going to have a game plan prepared for Fossil Dyna, maybe even in the main deck, and for that reason, I would call this a heavily favored matchup. Now let's talk about Hero Beat. Hero Beat, I think, is kind of one of the tragic stories of Edison Format. I like heroes. I think they're really cool. I played like a hand hero deck in Vegas format at a regionals, and I lost in the bubble in the last round. But I really enjoyed that deck. Unfortunately, this isn't Xyz era. This is Edison format, and Hero Beat is just not a very good deck. On top of that, we have access to Black Brute Drago, which just completely bodies Absolute Zero. So I would consider Hero Beat a free win. Similarly, Diva Hero is also just not going to be strong enough. I think the biggest strength of that deck, and this is like the hero deck that's playing Diva and Malicious and everything, is like a Colossal Fighter Armory Arm line. And, well, unfortunately, Titanial really shuts down Armory Arm. I think this is a better deck than just standard Hero Beat with like maybe like Skyscrapers and stuff like that. And it can sneak out some wins, but it's definitely still it's just a weaker deck. The ceiling is lower, and Gigavise is just going to stomp on it. So I would also call Diva Hero a free win. Let's talk about the Winged Rhinos deck. This is a really cool deck. It did well at a European UTW, and it's been a pretty constant presence on the online ladder ever since. I think it definitely has a lot of really cool plays. I'm a big fan of Chain Beat personally in later formats, and this feels very reminiscent of that. However, I also think it's a deck that once you understand what they're trying to do, and especially after your sideboard, you're definitely not going to have a very hard time against it. It can pose a threat. It can, you could find yourself in a situation where you just don't have an answer to all the back row, and you're able to, you can't get anything started. But, if this was a good deck, it would see more results other than that one fluke. I'm going to consider this a heavily favored matchup. You should be careful. You should play it smart, but it's just not that good of a deck. Now let's talk about Glads. Glads just won the UTW, or it got second place, in Orlando. It's definitely a real deck. It's definitely very strong. I think it's definitely very pilot dependent. In the hands of a good pilot, it can be a serious problem. Heraclinos and Chariot is a very, very hard board to overcome, so you need to have a good plan, and a lot of the things that seem like they might be good against Glads just don't end up being that good. I'm talking about side decking in like a Bestiari or siding a card like Swallow Flip. They're fun when they resolve, but sometimes they just don't help you. Sometimes Glads can just get hands that you can't beat. However, I do think if you're a good Gigavise pilot, you're going to be very competent at playing through a lot of back row. I think if you're just a good Edison player, you know what Glads are up to. You're able to get a pretty good read on what their sets are. And for that reason, I would call it a heads-up matchup. You definitely need to have something prepared in your side deck to answer Heraclinos and Chariot. But if you have that prepared, it's probably a favorable matchup. There's also, no offense, a lot of Glad players who are just not so good. And for that reason, I would consider this a matchup where you got to pay attention, you got to play smart, but you probably do have an edge. Speaking of matchups where you have an edge, let's talk about Blackwings, everyone's favorite bird deck. I'm not even going to waste any time. This is a very favored matchup. Even their busted hands, like Double Whirlwind Shura, that's just asking to get OTK'd. They really need to draw like Dark-Armed Dragon, Royal Oppression to have a good chance against you. And if you're prepared for those with a proper side deck plan, you're just not going to have an issue. A deck Devastation Virus, while it's very deadly against like a frog deck, more often than not, we're just going to be able to shrug it off. We might have 0 monsters in hand. We might have just a Dandelion. And even if they are able to hit a Lonefire Blossom, we have Miracle Fertilizer. So for a similar reason, I'm also going to go ahead and put the other bird deck, Vayu Turbo, in heavily favored. Similar to Machina, I think we play very well into Hamster Raikou Caius type strategies. And really the only problem is Royal Oppression. And when decks have such a narrow path to defeat you, it's very easy to prepare for those counter strategies and counter the counters So for that reason, I'm going to also put Vayu Turbo in heavily favored. I wouldn't call it a free win. Vayu Turbo, especially even more than Blackwings, is going to be able to have some just busted hands where you have a slow start and then you get OTK'd before you get a chance to go off. So use a little caution, but you're definitely favored in this matchup. Now, moving on, let's talk about, while we're covering the rest of the meta, other frog decks. So anything that isn't Fishborg frogs, perhaps hero frogs, perhaps classic frog monarchs. And I'm going to go ahead and say that in this matchup, it's a free win. You have such a powerful access to Titanial, and all of Frog's real power plays. I'm talking about Caius. I'm talking about Soul Exchange, Brain Control Caius, all this. It's just getting shut down by Titanial. And they're not able to appropriately deal with your strong boards. They also tend to be slow starts, so you're going to get some turns to be able to find your way to the cards that you need to win the game. I'm also going to count Hero Frogs as a free win. Hero Frogs loves to just go Stratos pass with no protection, and anytime your opponent leaves a monster with over 1,000 attack on the board with little protection, they're just asking to get OTK'd, and it's going to be a free win. Now, you might say, well, what about Absolute Zero? And to that, I would say, just play around it. Like, dog, Absolute Zero is a good card, but we have so many ways to play around it. If you're expecting it, you can just, like, leave your Titanial in defense, and they're not going to have anything to crash into it. You can make Brute Drago, and Brute Drago is just such a clean answer to Absolute Zero that it just... Heroes, they're just falling apart in the face of Gigavise. Now, speaking of Gigavise, let's talk about the mirror match. I'm going to put it in 50-50. If you are the better player, you're probably going to win the mirror match. You definitely need to be aware of things. Establishing Titanial presence is really, really key here. Siding in Autonomous Action Unit is also really key here. But ultimately, I think that it's going to be 50-50. If one player draws really good and the other player doesn't, that's it. That's variance. This is the game that we play called Yu-Gi-Oh! The next big OTK deck I want to talk about is the Fish OTK deck. This is a real deck. I think, maybe similar to Gigavise, there's a little bit of a skill barrier that's keeping players from really taking off with it, and I'm fine with that. I think you definitely need to have a game plan. I think a lot of their stall cards can present a real problem. But, similar to like Diva Hero, Titanial is such a good answer to Colossal Fighter Armory Arm that a lot of their OTKs just don't work if you're prepared for it. You definitely want to leave things in defense so they can't, equip a bunch of Armory Arms and crash into it. But, you have a lot of ways out. You have a lot of ways to play around it. If you are a good player, you can maybe even argue that you're heavily favored against the Fish OTK, but I think all the stall cards that they're playing can present a serious problem. So for that reason, I think Heads Up is a fine place to put it. Now, let's talk about some of the really dumb decks. Final Countdown. I played against Final Countdown Frogs on ladder the other day, which is the only reason I really included this. I think that actually does have potential, stalling with Dupe Lock and then thinning your deck out to be really sure that you're going to draw all of your stall cards is really good. Unfortunately, Dupe Lock is one of the easiest things for Gigavise to answer. Like, honestly, if you're a Frog player, just don't even bother with the Dupe Lock. Gigavise is just going to answer it, and you're just going to lose. Maybe that's all you have to do, and that's why we're dunking on Frogs all the time. But I'm going to put this as a free win. Honestly, if you have a good side deck plan prepared, you're not going to have a problem against Final Countdown. And Chainburn. Chainburn, I think, is a little better if you want to play something degenerate, alternate win condition. But especially after side decking, we've got lots of answers. If you're a competent player, you can definitely defeat Chainburn pretty consistently. Now let's talk about dragons. Dragons is kind of like the spiritual predecessor to Gigaplant. Everyone is talking about Gigaplant kind of in terms of Dragon Turbo, like, oh well, it's a lot like Dragon Turbo, where it's a high skill ceiling deck that has some really explosive plays, and it's it's kind of seen as, oh well, this is actually a tier 1 deck, but not enough people play it. But I gotta tell you, we generally have a really strong matchup against Dragon Turbo. I'd be tempted to put it in free win or even heavily favored. However, they do have access to Eradicator Epidemic Virus, which is a serious problem for Gigavise. We're playing a lot of spells, and for that reason, I'm going to say it's heads up. We definitely have the opportunity to win. If we're drawing really well, it's not going to present a problem, but you do have to be aware of the potential for Eradicator. So I'll consider them in the heads up tier. Now let's talk about another very explosive deck, Machine OTK. While I think generally we have very good machine matchups, the explosiveness of Machine OTK, similar to Fish OTK, similar to Dragon Turbo, can present a serious problem. I think out of all the decks like these, these heavy combo oriented, very fast explosive decks, Gigavise is the best, and we're definitely favored against them, but you do have to be aware, and you do have to really hope you don't brick against something like Machine OTK. Now let's knock out some other of these decks that are maybe less popular. I have Gallus up here for Monster Mash. You have to play carefully, so you're not just getting blown out by a Battle Fader or a Gores, but they don't have back row. As long as you have something ready for their Fossil Dyna, not a problem. I would call Monster Mash a free win. The Gemini deck. This is a deck that they're going to play a pretty hefty trap lineup, which of course can present a problem if you're not careful. But they're also a deck that could be leaving a Gigaplant on field, which is just prime for us to go ahead and mark the rows. Of course, they could try and take your Gigaplant and do something with that, and that's always something you have to be aware of. But ultimately, I think that this deck, it's kind of just a worse version of what we were doing with Gigavise. So I would call that a heavily favored matchup. Let's talk about Zombies now. Zombies is a really cool deck. I think a lot of people just like Zombies. And they definitely have some strong plays, but I have to say that Zombies are a free win. They're a deck that's kind of trying to do something similar to you, and they're just worse at it. They just have fewer options. All of their combo lines are more resource intensive, and they're just, I'm sorry to say it, they're just not good enough. And as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you have something prepared for anything that they might be siding in against you, I would consider Zombies a free win. Similarly, Tadad. Tadad is another deck that I think is underrepresented and has a lot of potential. But similar to Zombies, I think that they are just not quite strong enough. Now, Tadad is oftentimes not relying on bad cards like Pyramid Turtle and Recruiters. So it's definitely a little better than Zombies, even though it's kind of doing something similar. And they can definitely blow you out with the right hand. But I think, in general, they have a lot of trouble breaking our strong end boards. And for that reason, I would consider us heavily favored. Let's talk about Gravekeepers. Now, to an untrained eye, you might think that we actually have a very difficult Gravekeeper matchup because of Necro Valley. But I have something to share with you all that you may not be aware of. Gigaplant can continue to activate under Necro Valley. It does not target the graveyard, and it does not banish something in the graveyard. So for that reason, I'm going to say that Gravekeepers is a free win. We also shrug off Royal Tribute very effectively. We have such a low monster count, it just doesn't matter. I've played against Gravekeepers, and they'll very confidently Royal Tribute on turn 1, even being willing to discard one of their monsters to hopefully gain some advantage, and I will smugly show them 6 spells and traps in my hand, and they've got nothing to do. Next, let's talk about the other good plant deck, and that's Amaryllis. And I hate to say it, but it's not actually that good of a deck. I think Trade-In is just a bad card. I think playing 6 or even 5 level 8s is just it's just not good, dog. Amaryllis is slow. I've heard an argument that, well, it's a +1 every turn, just like a Gigaplant that sticks around. But if you think this 2200 joke of a card is comparable to a Gigaplant that's allowed to survive, let's play for cards. Let's play for money, dog. Like, I don't know what else to say. I think that Gigaplant or the Amaryllis decks can put up a Titanial on turn 1, and Titanial does stop us from equipping Supervise to our Gigaplant, and that is a problem. But especially after siding, I think that we're just, proven to be the better plant deck. I think also the fact that we can side in Autonomous Action Unit to get free Lonefire access against them really helps us. And even if they are able to make a Titanial, a lot of times their Titanial boards are just considerably more fragile. Now you have to play carefully against Amaryllis. You can't be leaving a Gigaplant for them to Mark of the Rose, because that's going to be really powerful for them. But I do think that we're just the better plant deck, and it shows in the Amaryllis matchup. And for that reason, I would consider us heavily favored there. Let's talk about a Stardust Assault Mode decks. I think these decks are bad. I think they're not good decks. However, Stardust Dragon Assault Mode is a powerful card, and I've found myself a lot of times in situations where this card is just presenting too much of an overwhelming threat. My opponent gets to it consistently, especially if I lose the die roll. And for that reason, I'm going to put them in the heads up tier. Like I said, it's just not a very good deck, and we're definitely favored, but it can present a serious problem. So, be prepared for it. Maybe even have something in your side deck that can answer a Stardust Dragon Assault Mode, and maybe something that also helps against some of these other less favorable matchups. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but maybe something exists. And that's where I think you can very confidently put it there. Six Samurai. Everyone loves Six Samurai. I think it's a very cool deck. If they open multiple gateways, it can be really, really scary. Unfortunately, a lot of what they're doing is just not very good. Now, if they are playing the variant that has like main decked Dimensional Fissure and the Guardian Iados, we don't really care about the Iados, but the Dimensional Fissure can present a problem sometimes, and floodgates like that can present a problem. If they're able to very quickly establish like a Grandmaster Spirit with some protection, maybe a Starlight Road and Gateway in circulation, Six Sams can definitely be a threatening deck. I don't think it's a good deck, but I think it's a real deck, if you know what I mean. But for that reason, I would say that we are heavily favored. It's not a free win. They do have floodgates. They can pose a real problem, but ultimately not that much. Gear Town decks. Gear Town decks are really cool. They can be very, very explosive. Gravekeepers is also kind of a Gear Town deck. However, I think Ancient Gear Gadgetron Dragon is one of the most just delicious things to take with a Mark of the Rose. Makes it so much easier to find a very easy OTK line. If you do that, if you're able to take a Gadgetron Dragon, your discard traps gets much, much more powerful, similar to how your decks themselves will use Compulsory Evacuation Device. And I also think that they're just not good enough. I think Gear Town is an underexplored card that has a lot of potential. I think it's a very good card. I think Gear Town decks are definitely, a frontier that has yet to be fully fleshed out and explored. But like I said, just because like a Gadgetron Dragon is such a juicy target to Mark of the Rose, it's such a nice way to find a Colossal Fighter OTK, I'm going to consider Gear Town decks a free win as well. Last two decks I really want to talk about here. First, I want to talk about the Neo-Spacian deck. This is like a really cool deck. I don't see it super common, but like Covert Contact, that's a crazy card. And I've played against this, and just like when they're drawing Dark Arm Dragon, it's a serious problem. I think they're actually able to answer our boards somewhat effectively. And like I said, Covert Contact is like a insane powerful card. They'll do some crazy shenanigans with like Dark Creator. So this is definitely a real deck. I think it's something that I could see people playing a lot more. I'd like to see it. I think it's a cool untapped potential for Edison. But ultimately, it's not as good as Gigavise, dog. Let's put that in heavily favored. And the last deck I want to talk about is actually Morphtronics. Morphtronics is a silly little deck. It's doing some silly little things. And I have it hovering over free win, and that is a fake out. I would consider it an unfavorable matchup. Morphtronics is a deck where you absolutely must be drawing combo efficiently. You must be drawing answers to their back row efficiently, because Morphtronics loves to get going with their little guys that let you attack directly, and then their little guys that make all their other little guys strong, and all of a sudden you're getting swung at for like 5,000 damage direct. And if you don't have an answer to that, and they're able to, just stop you for one turn, and then they're swinging directly again, they don't care how big your monsters are. They're not targeting you. They can do Ancient Sacred Wyvern nonsense and just kind of blow you out of the game out of nowhere. And I would actually consider Morphtronics to be an unfavorable matchup for the Gigavise deck. And finally, everything else is a free win. So these are just my thoughts. Obviously, this is very subjective. I'm fairly confident that I have played more Gigavise than you, but a lot of that time has been playing a severely suboptimal Gigavise deck. I'm willing to admit it. UFO Turtle is not a good card, and I have maybe 600-700 games playing UFO Turtle. So obviously I'm not right about everything. I am not purporting to be the end-all be-all expert on Gigavise, but I do think I have a lot of experience, and I hope you've benefited from some of that experience, and you're able to make some more informed decisions as we go into the brave new world of the Gigavise meta. This is Dionysus, aka Young Puds, signing off after some more shameless hype beast Gigavise content.